Hi, everyone. Welcome to this month's D3 webinar. My name is Corey Berg, and I am one of the associate directors on the Division 3 team. And no, your eyes are not deceiving you. I am an AMA staffer, and this is the October webinar. And don't worry, I will be back in December to make sure that we talk about proposals the same way we normally do each year. My co-pilot today is Katie Mucci. She's hanging out in the Q&A function. So if you have any questions as we go along, please use that Q&A function to get Katie your questions. And I'm going to try my best to get through all this material and save some time at the end. Also know that the slides for this presentation are up on nca.org and the recording will be up soon. Katie tells me by the end of the week. So knowing that I'm going to be back in a couple of months to talk about the convention proposals for January, I thought we could use our time together today to talk about the blue pages in the official notice. What exactly is in there? Why is it important for you on campus or at your conference office to know what's in there? Then we're going to run through 12 pieces of non-controversial legislation, things that have been adopted on the D3 membership's behalf between Phoenix and right now. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is Division 3's very first piece of emergency legislation that was adopted by President's Council back in August. So if you hear me say the official notice or the blue pages and you're like, Corey, I have no idea what you're talking about, this slide is for you. The official notice is what you see there on the left side of this slide. It's basically a playbook for all of the things that are going to go down during the Division 3 business session at convention in January. It has got proposals, it has got voting procedures, it's got rosters for who sits on the Division 3 councils, in case you've ever wondered who's actually like in the room when all these conversations are happening. Also in the official notice and on the right side of this slide are what's called the blue pages, and I am perfectly confident that you can all guess why they have that name. So what's in there? The blue pages are a series of appendices, each outlining the things that you see on this slide. Some convention years, you're going to see items in every one of these areas. In other years, you might only see one or two areas that have something to report out on. For January, for 2025, you're going to see at least one thing in each of these four areas. So taking them kind of one by one, incorporations of interpretations, think something that used to live in LSDBI as an official interpretation is now going to be put in the Division 3 manual. So a little bit more user-friendly when it comes to finding some of those answers. Modifications of wording, those changes are, you guessed it, to the actual words that are in the manual, just to clarify whatever the original intent of that bylaw was. It doesn't actually change anything about the application of the rule. It's just for clarification purposes. And then we have the two areas that we're going to talk about today. Non-controversial legislation, so changes to the D3 rules that are adopted by Management Council sometime between conventions, so sometime between January to the next January, and then emergency legislation, which is adopted just by President's Council at some point between conventions, but emergency legislation is appropriate when there's some sort of legal or liability risk to the Division 3 membership, or when waiting to do things on the normal legislative timeline just isn't going to work. So whenever you see things in the blue pages, the bullets on this slide are the things that are common between each of those areas. First, they're already effective. So unless one of the councils felt like a delayed onset was appropriate, whatever is in the blue pages becomes effective as soon as that council approves it in final format. Next, well, yes, everything in the blue pages was acted on D3's behalf between the conventions. You all, as the full membership, have the chance to do a check and balance on all of those decisions at the business session in January. there's going to be a motion to kind of approve everything, ratify everything in one fell swoop. But it's also possible that someone might make a motion to pick out one item or two items or a couple of the items to talk about and vote on separately from the rest of the stuff in the blue pages. And then finally, if something or some things get pulled and discussed separately and voted on separately, if those votes are ultimately defeated, Division 3 will revert back to the pre-existing legislation in that area. So just know that there's no kind of amending on the floor. It's just, does the blue pages action move forward, or do we go back to how things were previously in Division 3? All right, so that was my background. We're going to dive in. Like I said, we've got 12 pieces of non-controversial legislation. I'm going to run through them as quickly as I can, again, to try to save us some time at the end. If you joined us in Vegas for regional rules or virtually for regional rules, these first two non-controversials are going to sound really familiar. The first one, non-controversial 2025-1, has to do with permission to contact. And previously, in order to talk to a student athlete of another four-year school about potentially coming to your school and participating, you had to get permission to contact them first. And this was true for NCAA institutions and NAIA institutions. This non-controversial proposal removed the requirement to get permission to contact for kids coming from NAIA schools. So now you only need to get that permission to contact when you want to talk to a D1 kid, a D2 kid, or another Division 3 student athlete. And here's where you can see NAIA was deleted under 13.112. Non-controversial proposal 2025-2 has to do with cannabinoids or cannabinoids or pot or cannabis or whatever you would like to call it. This piece of non-controversial legislation removed cannabis from the NCAA's list of banned drug classes. So that means if your teams or if you have student athletes who are lucky enough to qualify for an NCAA championship and they get drug tested while they're at that championship, they're no longer going to be tested for or penalized for cannabis. What's important to remember here is that this proposal was specific to testing at NCAA championships. So if you're doing things on your local, either institutional or conference level, and you want to continue to test for cannabis, that is totally something that you can do. We're just concerned about NCAA testing here. And then this slide is where you can find a lot of extra room because there was a lot of strike through getting this off the list. Couple of bylaws in bylaw 18, and then one small addition to a list of exceptions in bylaw 31.231. All right, on to the new ones that you may or may not have heard about yet. Non-controversial 2025-3 has to do with name, image, and likeness. So it established two types of student athlete protections and made them available to all of the student athletes in Division 3 who are out there doing their thing with name, image, and likeness. These protections come in the form of a provider registry, think Yelp style, where student athletes can go in and rate different service providers they're working with. And then also various educational modules that student athletes can check out, can watch, can learn from if they're trying to navigate this NIL landscape. If they want to learn more about doing their taxes or how to effectively build your personal brand, or what is some sample language I should look for if I'm doing contracts with different NIL providers. All of those educational modules are available to Division 3 student athletes. If you have been following NIL in D3 for the last several years and you have asked staff a question, we probably gave you an answer that tagged something in bylaw 12. But this non-controversial legislation actually created an entirely new bylaw for Division 3. It's bylaw 22. It is specific to name, image, and likeness. So head to this new bylaw anytime you need some information about questions that you're getting regarding NIL opportunities. And then just one quick side note before I go on to number 4 is those student athlete protections that I talked about a couple slides ago are all housed on this platform. It's called NIL Assist. It was a collab between the national office and Teamworks, and it's kind of one-stop shopping for all things NIL. Again, all student athletes in D3 have access to this. If your institution is already a Teamwork school, it's going to be a really smooth process for you. If you're not a Teamwork school, that is okay. Just go to the help page on this platform, and then you can find how to get hooked up with the Influencer app, which will give you access to the educational modules and the provider platform. nilassist.ncaa.org. All right, moving on. Non-controversial 2025-4. This moves the directive for graduates of non-Division III institutions from the legislative relief waiver space, which we all knew and some of us loved, into the Division III manual. So now if you have student athletes who meet the criteria of that waiver directive, you can certify them on campus without actually needing to submit anything into RSRO for staff to process. And here it is. These are the exact same waiver criteria that we had before, but they are now in the D3 bylaw under bylaw 14181. All the criteria are the same. So you have to have graduated within 4 academic years, can't have any breaks in full-time enrollment during your undergraduate career, and you have to have at least 1 season of participation remaining in your sport per Division III rules. If you can confirm that, like I said, certify that student athlete on campus. If you're working with a non-D3 grad who misses on 1 or more of those criteria, those are the student athletes that we will still need to see an individual waiver request submitted in RSRO. Give us the case, tell us why they are not meeting the criteria. We'll take a look and see if that mitigation is compelling. Okay, we are going to move from the grad students to international PSAs. Non-controversial 2025-5 involves the amateurism certification process for our international prospects. It is entirely possible for one reason or another that an international prospect may arrive on your campus ready to go. It's time to practice, but they haven't yet received their certification decision from the eligibility center. If that's the case, you're really going to like this proposal because it's going to give those international PSAs a 45-day temporary certification period where they're allowed to practice, not compete, just practice while they wait for that decision from the EC. And then during that 45-day period, they're not going to be charged for a season of participation, even if the team they're practicing with starts to compete. What's important here is once the eligibility center does hand down its certification decision, the PSA needs to stop participating if that decision is not final certified. And here's where that's going to be reflected as an additional exception to triggering a season of participation under bylaw 14241. Non-controversial 2025-6 is a quickie. It is adding 2 awards to the to-do list for the honors committee. And those awards are the Gerald Ford and the Pat Summit Award. The honors committee already decides things like the Teddy Roosevelt Award, the Silver Anniversary Award, today's Top 10 Award, the Inspiration Award, and the Award of Valor. All that stuff that's distributed at convention, the honors committee already takes care of all of those nominations and selections. And so folding the Gerald R. Ford Award and the Pat Summit Award in there is just an effort to streamline the process. And there it is reflected in 21233. we've got a couple of non-controversials that you'll see over the coming slides that have to do with the Division III membership process. And the first one is here on the slide, non-controversial 2025-7. When schools from the outside, either outside of D3 or outside of the NCAA entirely, want to become members of Division III, they submit a pretty substantial application to do so. And then the D3 membership committee takes a look at those applications and says, okay, we're going to let you begin the membership process, or here are some things that we think you can fit. What this non-controversial proposal did is it is going to move the current deadline for that proposal from January 15th up, back, forward, from January 15th to February 1st each year. So it's going to give those schools interested in D3 a little bit more time to get their stuff together and submitted for the membership committee to take a look at. And here's that change. So we've got a couple of bylaws in play, 26-2, 2010-2, and 2010-2. You can see there each have February 1st. Sticking with the membership process for one more, 2025-8. Those schools who enter the provisional process, so they're coming from outside of the NCAA, trying to get into Division III as active members. Right now, those institutions have the ability to have an exploratory year. They kind of want to put feelers out, see if D3 is the right place for them before they full on commit and enter the membership process. What this non-controversial proposal did is it took the pre-existing waiver criteria. So if there was a school who knew they didn't want to do the exploratory thing, they wanted to get into D3 right away, they could have previously applied for a waiver. If they met certain criteria, they could do that. This proposal takes that waiver criteria, puts it in the overall application materials. So now if schools applying from the outside to get into D3 can demonstrate they meet those criteria, no exploratory year required for them. They can get right to that D3 process. And here it is. Those criteria now live in bylaw 2010-1. All right, this one is a bit involved, but don't worry, don't freak out. Ask questions in the Q&A if you have them. Non-controversial 2025-9, it deals with standardized dates in a delayed enrollment analysis. And if you're thinking, I don't know what a delayed enrollment analysis is, don't worry, I've got you. Here's a very, very quick crash course. When PSAs graduate from high school, they have a legislated 1-year period that they can go out there and engage in organized competition before they enroll in college without subjecting themselves to any potential penalties. If you have PSAs who go right from high school, right to college at the first opportunity, you're not even tracking on this. But if you have PSAs who don't go to college right away, you have to start thinking about a delayed enrollment analysis. What are they out there doing past the time where maybe they could have enrolled in college? And when you're doing this analysis, a kind of like natural question comes forward, and that is, well, what date represents the end of the 1-year grace period, where they then grace period, and then they hit that date, maybe they subject themselves to penalties. Right now, or before this proposal, that was an institution by institution determination. So if a prospect was looking at multiple Division III institutions, that end of the grace period could be a lot of different dates. And so what this proposal did is it said, okay, let's standardize the end dates of the grace period. So if someone is enrolling in the fall, the end of that grace period is going to be October 1. If they're enrolling in the spring, the end of that grace period is going to be March 1st. That way, all prospects who have delayed their college enrollment know the exact date that they need to stop participating in organized competition, or else they might subject themselves to some penalties once they get to Division III. So that was a mouthful, but again, if you have most of your kids going right from high school to college, there's no delayed enrollment involved. But here it is in bylaw 14.244. Again, if you have questions about delayed enrollment, I'm happy to answer them here if we have time at the end, or I'll see you in RSRO and we can get it done there. All right, I think this is our last one in the membership space, non-controversial 2025-10. Right now, D3 bylaws say, okay, international PSAs who enroll at Division III schools on or after August 1st of 2023, you need to have your amateurism certified by the NCAA's Eligibility Center. What this proposal did is it provides an exception for schools in the membership process, because there may be student athletes, international student athletes at those institutions who were not being held to Division III rules when they enrolled at their school because their school was not a Division III member at that time. So what this proposal says is only international PSAs initially enrolling at those schools, once the school's in the process, have to go through that EC amateurism process. And then there it is, 2652 and 2010-52. All right, two more left, and they are quick. Non-controversial 2025-11, if you have ice hockey, this is for you. It eliminated the off-ice training exception for ice hockey to get rid of all of that confusion between what's on ice, what's off ice, what about if I'm using some of my 8 days outside of the season, what about acclimatization? It all got kind of mumbled and jumbled and confusing. And so what this proposal did is it straight up got rid of that off ice training week, and you can see right there it's struck through the bylaw in 1714-2 or 1742, excuse me. Oh no, it is 14. So pardon my typo at the top. And then finally, our last piece of non-controversial legislation that you're going to see in the blue pages for January is number 12, which established a new playing start and end date for the sport of Nordic skiing. So now, if your institution offers Nordic skiing, you can start your playing season as early as October 8th, and you can run it through as late as March 29th, or the US Nordic Super Tour Finals, whichever is later. And here it is reflected in the skiing bylaws, 17, 19, 2, 3, and 4. All right, so I'm powering through. Got one more thing to talk about, and I'll open up for questions. It's that emergency legislation that was adopted by President's Council back in August. It has to do with transfers. So if you have ever asked a transfer question in RSRO, if you have ever heard any of the staff present on transfers at regional rules, you likely had it drilled into your mind that the default starting position of a transfer analysis is serving an academic year in residence at a Division III institution. This emergency legislation eliminated the year of residence as the default condition. So now, instead of saying you will sit unless you meet an exception, what you're doing in your transfer analysis is you're confirming that a student athlete can be immediately eligible for competition at your D3 school. If they're not immediately eligible, if they leave their previous institution academically ineligible, they're still ineligible once they get to you in Division III, but you can have the chance to recertify that student athlete after their first full-time term at your institution. So for example, if you had a student athlete arrive at your school this fall 24, and they didn't leave their original institution academically eligible, but after the completion of this fall 24 term, they've got it together and they're meeting the standards that you require of all student athletes at your institution, that student athlete's going to be good to go for spring 25. So hopefully this is an exciting change for some people out there. A couple important things to know when it comes to this emergency legislation. Does it apply to both 2-year transfers, 4-year transfers? The answer is yes. That is actually something that D3 did a little bit more than what 1 and 2 did. 1 and 2 just handled things in the 4-year space. In Division 3, we made this applicable to both 2-year and 4-year transfers. Is it now just a term and residence? No, not really. Because again, we got eliminated the whole residence bit. What you're focusing on now is treating student athletes who transfer while not academically eligible to your school. You're going to treat them in the same way as any academically ineligible student athlete at your school. You're going to give them that full-time term to get their act together. If they're meeting all your standards, they're good to go. A really popular question we get is, does this let student athletes who transfer under disciplinary suspensions off the hook? And the answer is no. This all has to do with your academic eligibility. If someone transfers to your D3 school under disciplinary suspension, nothing's changing in their analysis. And then the last thing there, are legislative relief waivers still a thing? The answer is yes. So if you have someone come to your school, you confirm that they cannot be immediately eligible for you, but you want them to compete right away, absolutely still check out the legislative relief waiver guidelines and directives document, submit an individual case. We'll take a look at it and see what we can do. So Katie, I made it to the end. I see at least one orange bubble in the Q&A, but we've got a couple minutes left. If you want to fire away, I'll see what I can do.
Sure. So we'll start with the most recent question. So how does the delayed enrollment legislation dates consider those that are post grade 12 prep school students or grade 13 in Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. So under our delayed enrollment bylaws, there are certain exceptions that exist. So there are prep school exceptions that exist. There are certain participation exceptions that exist. So this is what I was describing with the non-controversial proposal, is more for your run-of-the-mill kid who also does not meet another existing exception. So Tucker, if you've got a specific student athlete in mind, throw them up in RSRO. We'll take a look and we can confirm on whether or not they meet an exception for you.
Awesome. And another delayed enrollment one. Will the delayed enrollment legislation impact ice hockey?
So not knowing the full context of that question, because I know that there's some ice hockey stuff out there kind of circling right now, especially when it comes to major juniors. None of that has changed, but depending on the exact facts of a given student athlete's history, the delayed enrollment legislation is meant to be applied evenly across sports, but knowing that there are some sports like ice hockey that have a couple of quirks. So again, happy to sort through a specific student athlete in RSRO.
Next one, going back quite a bit, it was one of the first questions. For international student athletes, is it safe to assume that the 45 days are calendar days and not 45 days of athletically related activity?
Yeah, that's right.
Perfect. One that came at the end, are there other transfer exceptions still in play?
Yeah, so when you're doing a transfer analysis, if you have someone who has never practiced or competed in intercollegiate athletics, that's still a way to be immediately eligible for competition. Being academically eligible where you came from, that is still a way to be immediately eligible for competition. The 2-year non-participation exception, that's still an option. So great question, Jennifer. And yes, so check out bylaw 1454 for your 2-year transfers and 14551 for your 4-year transfers. You'll see each of the options laid out for you.
All right, I got 2 more transfer questions I'm going to try and squeeze in here.
Yeah.
The first one, just to confirm, if a Division I student athlete transfers to a Division III and is academically ineligible, they get eligible their first semester at that D3, then transfer to another D3, they are eligible, question mark. Or would they have to still have to serve a minimum semester?
Yeah. So in most situations, yes. If someone, whether they come from D1, D2, another D3, an NAIA, any four-year institution, they didn't leave their original institution eligible. They come there, they get their act together, they're meeting all the standards you have for all your student athletes. They're good to go at the end of that term. That is what this legislation does. There are certain situations, again, that this wouldn't be applicable, like the disciplinary suspension that I described, or if you have an unfulfilled year of residence at a previous institution and you're coming to D3, but those are far less common situations that we see.
All right, and my last one, kind of a logistics question on this.
Okay.
If this emergency legislation gets overturned through a vote during convention, will students who transfer in January be eligible after one semester, or will they need to go back to serving a year in residence?
Yeah, that is kind of the $1 million question right now. We are tracking on it. That would be a decision that the Subcommittee for Legislative Relief, 8 people who also sit on Management Council, they would have that conversation ASAP if that happens in January. So it is not something we're planning for it as much as we can right now, but we can't give you a direct decision because if the emergency legislation were to be pulled out and defeated, that group would have to have a conversation about what we do with the student athletes who thought they'd be ready to go for spring 25. So stay tuned.
Since we are over 2 o'clock, Corey, I'll cut it off there, but thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. There's a Q&A document out there. If you need it, shoot me an email, find me an RSRO. I'll hook you up. And then if you get more questions on your campus, especially on this transfer piece, let us know because we can update that Q&A document as needed as new questions come in. All right.